The spend shift report was created to answer one fundamental question. What does smart strategic marketing procurement look like today? I think to answer that question and to give the audience a bit of context around it, it'd be interesting to discuss how marketing procurement has evolved and try and answer where are we right now and what is the data telling us about marketing procurement today. So for me, I think that marketing procurement has come a long way. The traditional view that marketing procurement have been cost savers, but I think the picture these days is quite different. They're kind of driving strategy. How did we get here?
Yeah, that's a really good question and an important part of what we cover in the report. Everything is about context, and even in the report itself, there's a whole section at the back which looks at the timeline where marketing procurement started and when it started and how we sort of got here. Going back to before the 1980s, there was no real formal role for it. Relationship. It was all about relationships between clients and agencies. It was about trust over process. As the 1980s and particularly the 90s emerged, procurement really started to arrive in the marketing field. They'd obviously been there in other parts of a business in terms of direct costs and raw materials and staffing and so on, but they'd never really dived much into what we call the indirect costs until probably in the late 80s and early 90s. And there was a few leading lights of the industry, one of whom, Tina Fegan, was we're very grateful that she contributed a lot to the actual finished report. And from that point, they started to look at cost control and process. And that then turned into the 2000s, and we started to see the beginnings of this whole digital transformation for businesses. There was suddenly more categories to think about. There was more sourcing structures to think about. The fragmentation of agencies continued as more specialists and more niche players arrived on the market. And then as we go into the 2010s, again, looking at the overall timeline, procurement really started to have a role being a value creator. It wasn't just about cost control. It was about innovation. It was about customer experience. It was about the marketing ecosystems. And that kind of brings us nicely to where we are today, where in many ways the industry in which we operate in is even more diverse and more fragmented. You've got some transformational things happening. First, it was things like automation and sustainability and diversity, inclusivity and equality. Now we obviously are in the world of AI, and all of that is completely sort of changing the game in some respects. And that's even before we mention things like the pandemic and how that effectively turned the whole structure upside down. So when you actually look back at the last few decades on this, each one brought new sort of responsibilities. But as we look here in the middle almost of 2025, we can see that procurement is very much being expected to change in the sector. So that's a quick overview of where we are. And that last point is the most important one in some respects. It's like, where are we now? Where does the spend shift report fit into that? And it's like, well, we're in this transitional phase. Budgets are tightening. We've seen the emergence of two-speed marketing sort of setups, the idea of the need to do campaigns, the idea of the need to do content, and that content demand is ever increasing. Technology is disrupting how work was traditionally done. Agency ecosystems are evolving to the point where it's all about how do you get efficiency. And finally, and certainly last but not least, the likes of AI and automation are no longer things to think about for the future. They're happening right now. So as a result of all of this, when we talk to marketing procurement, and we had a really good panel just a few weeks back at ProcureCon in London, and lots of conversations around that there's 4 or so key messages coming through. We're seeing procurement is being asked to sort of have influence early in the process. They're needing to build sort of smarter supplier relationships. They're having to manage even more complex ecosystems, and they're expected or driving the delivery of value beyond just the savings. And that's where we are in 2025 now, when we're looking at the overall picture of marketing procurement and where, importantly, the spend shift report fits into that.
Absolutely. And I think that, just to summarize what you've said there, Austin, I think that the expectation is no longer just about get a better rate. It's about shaping an outcome. moving from buying things to actually building an ecosystem where the procurement teams act as connectors and not just controllers. I think that's a trend that is going to continue, and it's something that has really defined the outcomes of the Spencership report.
Yeah, that's absolutely it.